In this module, I'll introduce some different ways of approaching narrative analysis. One way of approaching narrative analysis is noticing when a narrative occurs and trying to demarcate narratives from the ambient discourse in which they are embedded. A lot of the times people are just having a conversation, and then there'll be what's often called a breakthrough into narrative or a breakthrough into storytelling. This builds on the work of Bauman and Briggs. So in an actual discourse transcript, in a conversational transcript, sometimes we need to actually figure out what exactly is the narrative and what is sort of just the surrounding content. Richard Bauman divided these things into two sort of worlds. That there's the story realm and then there's the tale world. So the tale world is actually the world inside of the narrative. And even though it will be one person talking, that one person is speaking for all of the different characters in that world. It could be the real world in which we live or meant to be, but just a different time. For example, a past event or an alternate present or an alternate future of the world. It could be an imaginary world. But the tale world is what we normally think of as a proper narrative. This is the world in which characters are sort of doing their thing. Most movies start out by jumping you right into the tale world. They don't have a realm of the story being told. Maybe an exception to this would be The Princess Bride, where kind of the conceit of the movie was that there was a sick grandson and the grandfather, and so they were actually telling the story. They would jump back and forth between the sick kid on the bed with the grandfather talking to him. So the action involved the telling of the story itself, and then it would cut back into inside the world of the story with its own characters in their own voices. And so that movie is an interesting one, sort of playing with this jumping back and forth between the tale world and then the story realm. The story realm is the one in which the storyteller is addressing their listeners, incorporating the listener's perspectives, the listener's reaction. There'll be a lot of commentary on maybe how the story is being told or why the story is being told. Listeners of the story, the sort of the audience members for this narrative, are aware that they are co-present with others. This is where listeners are commenting on the other people who are listening along with them or commenting on the storyteller. Listeners are alert to their own contributions to the story and the effect the story has on them, so that they are evaluating, taking stances toward the things that are happening within the tale world. They're taking evaluative stances or affective stances, talking about the emotions that the story evokes in them. So the tale world is one in which people are talking within that. The story realm is where people are gathered for the purpose of listening to a narrative which is being shared by some actor. And of course, all of this is then further embedded into real life. That will kind of leave our real life and enter a story realm in which, hey, let's get together and listen to a story. And then we'll even leave that story realm and begin to then enter into the actual tale world where the different actors within the story are interacting with each other. Let's look at an example of this. In this transcript of a interview excerpt, and I've basically demarcated this into three different worlds. The story realm is this blue text and also in some ways this capitalized unhighlighted text altogether. This is the text where speakers are aware of the fact that they have an audience, or audience members are aware of the fact that they are audience members who are privileged to a story which is being told. And then the yellow is definitely inside that tale world. This is a world where people within the narrative, within the story, are speaking to themselves. And we can see that this tale world is kind of broken up and embedded in a couple different ways into the larger ambient discourse, that people are kind of moving out from the real world in through into the tale world, and then kind of back out, back in, back out again, then back into the tale world, back out for a little bit, then back into the tale world. So language helps someone to just say, well, you're nice and all, but the message of Jesus Christ, that's for Americans. You speak English. And so we're Bosnians, we're different. We don't have the same language and we have our own. They would say we have different mentality. They would say in English, I don't know what the word is in Bosnian. They'd always say, we're Muslim and we're Catholic or whatever, because we're a different mentality than you are. So this is all being spoken by the same person, But this speaker is doing some very complicated narrative work here in sort of demarcating three different worlds. In the black world here, the unhighlighted world, language, I don't know what the word is in Bosnian, we can actually use the pronouns as a clue. I, in this case, am an interviewee. So the person who's telling the story is taking on the role of an interviewee in this black text. You, if you appears, is the interviewer right here. And then when we is used, we don't see we in this transcript, but there were cases where we is used to refer to both the interviewer and the interviewee. So we is seen as being a joint identity which is shared between the interviewer and the interviewee. The we is a we about telling the story. We is a we of we are both involved in this interview. This blue world is sort of a transitional world in which I am a storyteller, not an interviewee. I've left kind of my role as being interviewed and more I'm entering into my role as the narrator. They refers to Bosnians here. A third person is being invoked. They would say in English, they'd always say, this is going to be Bosnians here. We, again, we don't see a we in this transcript in the blue world, but it does exist. We, when it's used, refers to Americans and predominantly to the Americans that are in this story. And you would be an interviewer still. So this is kind of a boundary world, a liminal space. This is the part of the story world in which the teller is orienting away from the real world and orienting towards the tail world. Then yellow is properly the tail world, and we can tell that by the pronouns. I am not an interviewee, I'm not a storyteller, but I'm a character in my story. In this case, the person who's talking is no longer an interviewee, is no longer a storyteller, but that person has become a character within the story, within this imagined past. We refers to Bosnians, so this person is ventriloquating Bosnians here, is speaking in the voice of Bosnians. See, we are Bosnians, we are different, we don't speak the same language, we have our own, we have a different mentality. So the speaker has left himself and is entering this we of the Bosnians. In fact, when Americans are talked about at all, when that person who's being interviewed appears in the story, it's as a part of this you. You speak English, Americans. We're a different mentality than you are. This person is placing themselves within that second person you. That's a sign that they're in this tail world here. So we can actually see this is one way of dividing up a narrative, is between this moving back and forth between a storyteller primarily existing as a narrator or moving into existing as characters within the story. Now in this narrative, it's pretty much all within the story realm, that kind of storytelling world, where the person who's speaking identifies as a narrator, where they're aware of the fact that they're interacting with an audience. They don't actually enter the tale world themselves to speak as if they were inside the story. This is kind of a third-person narrator rather than a first-person within the story narrator. So this whole thing exists basically within that story realm, within that world of storytelling. But there's other ways that we could divide this up. One way would be to parse apart the different roles that the words in this story are playing in terms of the development of the narrative. We have a phrase of time orientation here, last summer. We have a phrase of place orientation. Where did this occur? In Yosemite. We have language whose purpose is to introduce actors, introduce characters in the story. We have we have my brother, and then we have these two women. We also have this narrative build-up. So this often happens, it's a sequence of events that are in chronological order, and it's in the past tense. That's a very characteristic, that's kind of how we know that we're dealing with a narrative, is that we usually have a time, an actor, and a place orientation, plus a series of events that are narrated in the past tense. We could use what's called the narrative past, which sounds like I'm using grammatically the present tense. Okay, so we walk down the street and we see this thing and it comes out. But the events are clearly understood to be taking place in the past. So we were almost to the lake where we were going to go. The air was pretty thin. Women were hiking up ahead of us. We got to a rise. The lake was right there where we were going to go camp. And the two of them got to that rise. So this is the narrative buildup, which culminates then in a climax. The next minute, they just fell over. Totally. This is from someone else. You're kidding. I guess the stop was too much. Both of them just totally passed out. And then we have a resolution. How does this climax, this situation get solved? They both came to life very quickly. And then this is sort of an optional thing, but often when people are telling a narrative, they sort of retell the story a second time for the key events. Basically, what is the recap or kind of the takeaway? I guess the hike, and then all of a sudden stopping, and the oxygen thing must have really confused them. This is basically the point of the entire story. This is why the narrative is being told. Maybe this was embedded within a larger conversation about passing out or about oxygen sickness or just about weird things that happen when you're hiking, but this is sort of the kernel. All of this stuff is basically a reason to render this new information to the discourse. Then it ends up with a stance toward the narrative. That actually very frequently occurs. It was very odd, so that this whole thing is kind of capped off by an active stance taking. So this is one way of analyzing a narrative. So what are the roles that the different pieces of language play within the narrative? We can look at a narrative through the eyes of definiteness. So in any narrative, there's going to be some information which is taken for granted, which couldn't be interpreted on its own, but which depends on something else within the narrative for its interpretation. This is what creates cohesion within a narrative, which makes it work well. Basically, what we can see in this version is that the red information, the definite information, is information which depends on something else in order to be interpreted. The red things cannot be interpreted on their own. They would need some prior knowledge, some prior context in order to be understood. And through this act of using language in a way which depends on prior knowledge or prior context, that has the effect of building cohesiveness, coherence within the narrative, as well as building the sense of we're in a shared enterprise together between the storyteller and the listeners. The blue information is information which supplies the identifiability, which supplies the understandability to the red. So we're almost to the lake. So you could assume that there's lakes maybe because of the fact that Yosemite Park has lakes, but I wouldn't know which lake we're talking about. It's actually the following phrase, where we're going to go, which supplies the identifiability to this definite construction, the lake. The lake, which lake, where we were going to go. And the air, which air. The fact that air always exists is probably makes it easy to interpret. We don't normally talk about many different air, but I guess if there was anything that's going to supply interpretability to this, the air, it's going to be Yosemite. The air in Yosemite was pretty thin. That's a comment on it. Us. So us as a pronoun cannot be interpreted on its own. It has to look backwards for something to interpret. So it looks back first to this we, and then this we gets its meaning from the combination of I plus my brother. This we gets its meaning from us, got to arise, and the lake was right there. Again, this lake gets its meaning from this lake, which gets its meaning from where we were going to go. Where we were going to camp, again, this we gets its meaning from this we, which gets its meaning from this us, which gets its meaning from this we, which gets its meaning from I and my brother. You can see how these chains of co-reference work their way through the narrative and unite it together into a coherent narrative. The two of them, so the two of them, this has to refer back to two women. This thing in the indefinite two women is going to supply the identifiability to this phrase, the two women. Got to the rise. The rise has already been supplied identifiability by this phrase, arise. And the next minute, so how do I know the next minute? The next minute after what? This, I think it's its interpretability, its identifiability from the phrase got to. When they got to the rise, the next minute after that, they just fell over. So they gets its meaning from them, which gets its meaning from the two women. So there's another chain. Totally, you're kidding. I guess the stop. Which stop? Stop is sort of new information, but it's maybe identifiable via got to the rise and the fact that they fell over, so that was a stop. Both of them and they, them, the two women came to life very quickly, but I guess the hike gets its understanding from the two women hiking up. So that provides interpretability to the hike. Then all of a sudden stopping, and the oxygen thing. Now this looks like it doesn't really have anything to supply it. What oxygen thing are we talking about? This seems like it's a new idea, the oxygen thing. But maybe there's a weak link between this phrase, pretty thin. So you would have to know that there's a link between air being pretty thin and meaning that it doesn't have a lot of oxygen. So it's this thing way back there which supplies meaning here. Must have really confused them. So them, they, them. Again, back to the two women. It was very odd. It is also really unclear. Is it that the oxygen thing was really odd, or they're all of a sudden stopping? My guess is that it being really odd is their fell over. But it's a little bit hard to say what is giving this here. That makes it ambiguous. It's unclear what exactly I'm commenting on. It, in fact, could be this entire story. So we can see that this link between things that don't have an identifiable meaning on their own, they depend on something else in the narrative in order to get their meaning, creates cohesion. There's a lot more of this blue stuff in the early part of the narrative. There's a lot more setup, and then the red things which occur later on in the narrative depend on that earlier blue information for identifiability. And this is part of what happens when we tell a narrative. We could also try to break apart this narrative based on the syntax, where I would have subjects and predicates. So that's what I basically did here. All of the subjects of clauses within this narrative are bolded here. The predicates are all in this sort of normal text. They're all lined up. So this is all of the predication that's happening. This is a list of the subjects, and we can see basically two sets of recurring subjects, we, and then also the two of them, they, them, they. So it kind of transitions over from we being the main subject of the first half of the narrative to them, they in the second half of the narrative, and we basically disappears right at this point. The focus switches from my brother and I and over to these two women, and it basically stays there the whole time. We also have these orienting expressions. These are underlined. So things like last summer, where, then is orienting information about the setting of the events, where and when it happened. And then these I guess, this is also orienting, but these are epistemic stances. This is orienting the predication that's happening here, basically by an act of stance taking, an epistemic stance. I forgot, the next minute is also part of the orienting about the when. We've got whens and wheres that are happening here, whereas this is then the whos and the whats. And then all of these ands and buts. So all of these conjunctions here lined up. This is basically indicating the sequential nature of the events. It's these ands and buts which tie this whole thing together into a neat package to being a coherent narrative as well. So grammatically, it's interesting to see the grammatical setup, how syntax is being used to create this narrative and to alert the learners that this whole thing is meant to be understood as a whole.